From an AI perspective, making sure it's secure by design is important, but then also understanding what's in your environment, what does it interact with? Build those processes and procedures around the use of that technology. I know one of the biggest concerns I have is data put into an AI tool, then you lose ownership of it. What's happening with that data in the background? And that, if that's PII or personal identifiable information, that could be an issue. So the organization needs to understand how that tool is being used and build the process, procedures, and requirements around it.
Welcome to the Industrial Cybersecurity Insider. In each episode, we dive into the world of industrial cybersecurity. Join us as we cover the latest trends, innovations, and practical insights as we talk with leaders and practitioners across the industry. Gear up and let's get into this week's episode.
Hi, my name is Dino Busalaki, and today we have Chris Cockburn from CISA joining us. Hi, Chris.
Hey, how you doing, Dino? Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for joining us today. Why don't we begin with a little background and bio on Chris and his journey through the CISA organization?
Well, absolutely. Appreciate that. I've been with CISA for about 3 years now. Prior to that, I came out of the Department of Defense, where I spent about 24 years as enlisted or doing contract and support as a government civilian. In that time, I got to do all kinds of things from cyber defense to enterprise management and have a little stint where I was doing some offensive stuff, doing bad things to bad people with cyber. So, it's been kind of a fun career. But 3 years ago, just before 3 years ago, a good friend of mine had kind of enlightened me on this position. I got to know a little bit more about what we did, and I was looking for a change to get out of the DoD. So when I look at the mission of what CISA does, and I was coming out of that whole support and defend the Constitution, freedom of the U.S. and everything, this was a good transition to where now I still get to support and defend the United States, but that's through protecting critical infrastructure and those things that we rely on a daily basis. So it's been a fun ride so far.
Yeah. So cybersecurity, generally speaking, to me, and for a lot of people, it's a really big word, right? It's a boil the ocean kind of term. And I start at the big picture. So from a CISA perspective, can you give us an idea of just the state of the global industrial cybersecurity situation that's out there?
Well, the challenges today they're dynamic. They're rapidly evolving, from dealing with cyber criminals who are using tools like ransomware or conducting business email compromises, or we're dealing with on a daily basis. Then you look at the state-sponsored stuff, Russia, North Korea, China, Iran, and the operations that they're conducting and the advanced capabilities they have, the risk to our supply chain, the impacts that how things that happen in our supply chain can affect our organizations. Even severe weather. We're seeing impacts from severe weather. And then, of course, the uncertainty of how artificial intelligence is going to affect all this. Then add in the fact that there's so much complexity between critical infrastructure systems are interconnected. And then, of course, the convergence of cyber and physical type things. It's ever changing. There's so much going on that one major event can cascade and affect multiple areas of critical infrastructure. So that's why it's really important for us to understand how cybersecurity can help defend against any of those effects that would take down something that we rely on a daily basis.
Yeah. So the collaboration, with the private sector and the government. So can you provide some information on what you guys are doing, sharing between the government agencies, critical infrastructure groups, private sector, and what your role is, and what kind of conversations do you guys get involved with without getting anything specific, especially with particular organizations?
So CISA, we kind of sit in this unique place where we get to help develop partnerships and relationships to share information, to understand what's happening in cyber and on the physical side of things, the kinetic side of things. And we do that at multiple levels, right? So if we start at the top, CISA manages the Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative. And this is where we're bringing partners from private and public sector and even international partners into discussion when it comes to what's happening in cyber, right? So if we have a major event that's happening, there's a critical vulnerability or something like that needs to be addressed, we can reach into our partnerships through the Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative, or the JCDC, and bring the subject matter experts into the conversation, no matter if they're public or private. Think about it. The majority of critical infrastructure is privately held, right? So it's important that we have those partnerships. And then that information we get to distribute to the larger population. Now take that a step down and come out here to the region. CISA's got 10 regions, and we happen to sit in Region 7, which consists of Missouri, Kansas, Nebraska, and Iowa. Across there, we have a whole team of field advisors focused on cyber and physical threats. And we're here to partner directly with the owners and operators, no matter where they sit, private or public, and help them understand what their cybersecurity posture looks like. We can come in and sit down and do assessments with them. We can help them understand how to develop new programs and things like that. And the cool thing is, when CISA comes in, there's no price tag on it. We've all paid for it through tax dollars. We get to be an extension to that critical infrastructure's owners and operators. We get to be the extension of their team and better help support them. So that could be through advising through an incident, steps they should consider. But most of what we do is going to be before the incident, trying to make sure that their cybersecurity programs are ready to respond to incidents when they arise.
And a lot of those organizations, when I think about municipalities and these organizations where resources, there's strengths, right? One, finding the resources required to do this. So I've heard stats that there's 4 million open cybersecurity positions. And our particular focus, mine over the last several years, has been on OT, right? And talking to these organizations, that's a challenge for them, right? To get these technologies, to build a practice, to be able to execute, right? There's the assessment capabilities that you guys are providing them, but then there's that next activity is, okay, now you got to do something.
Absolutely.
But so why do you see that unwinding out there with those particular situations, and specifically around critical infrastructure, which is important?
Yep. Yeah. So you're really kind of hitting the target of what we call target-rich, resource-sparse entities, right? And so CISA has a huge focus on a few of the sectors that's more prevalent in. So the idea is we're focusing heavily with K through 12, wastewater, healthcare, and of course, elections is our number one target right now, making sure that that we can do what it is that makes us Americans, right? But when we think about those entities, going in through a K through 12 and helping them identify the areas that they need to focus on, knowing that they have a limited budget. A lot of times, the folks that are responsible for their IT and their cybersecurity have multiple hats, so they're spread thin, and they may just not have the experience to dealing with it, but it's still on their shoulders. With us coming in and giving us the ability to sit down with them, talk to them about where their issues are, well, then we can reach into our bag of tricks, right? And we've got free services that are available. We can provide a weekly vulnerability scan of their external facing IP addresses and let them know what's vulnerable, right? And then if they need some assistance with understanding what those reports, we're there to also pick up the phone and help walk them through it and point them towards maybe some other resources that might help out. And then on top of that, we actually maintain a list of free tools and services. Not all of them are maintained by CISA. Some of them they're going to be maintained by the private sector or even open source tools, but they're there. That's something that those entities can take advantage of when they don't have the budget to pay for it.
You brought something up interesting, talking because it is an election year. And to me, elections are one of those events that you have it coming and then it stops, goes away for a while, right? And then you've got another year, 2 years or 4 years before you got to go through it again. How does that impact? To keep continuity in the election process, what kind of role are you guys having to play? Is it just an ongoing relationship with the folks responsible for the election systems? Or is it, okay, we're going to gear up and then we're going to gear down?
Well, that's a good question. One thing to remember is we're focused on this being an election year, right? We've got a big presidential election coming up, a lot of emphasis on that, but there's elections going on all the time. So that infrastructure has to stay secure. There might just be local elections, but those are just as important because they're feeding that impact, how that local government's going to drive in the coming years. So we still, on a routine basis, we're constantly engaging with election officials if they need some assistance. Right now, we've had a huge push with things like tabletop exercises. We're making sure that the election officials know what resources are available and then help them walk through and test their plans to make sure if something does happen, they're ready to respond.
Yeah, I think it's important for the listeners is that there is activity being done. It's not like something that just pops up and what are we really doing about it? There's actually an ongoing program to deal with it. I'm going to shift gears a little bit. I want to talk about IT-OT convergence, or as I like to sometimes call it, IT-OT collision, depending on the relationship between these groups, right? Sometimes we like marriage counselors and introducing people that have been working in the same organization, sometimes for a decade or more, that have never met each other. And I also believe that, I don't know if the media gets it wrong, But when we have events, and we talked about CrowdStrike here most recently, because that was a big one, it was very impactful. And that wasn't even so much a cybersecurity event as much as it was cybersecurity technologies that were misconfigured, I guess is the word I would use. And we had clients that were impacted down on the plant floor because a lot of IT technologies are being used on the plant floor. Windows, for example, virtual machines, networking equipment. So tell us about your IT/OT activity going on and trying to get these two very different roles to be collaborative, to be aligned, to be transparent. So I would have experiences when you're engaging in the private sector, and I guess, and probably even in the public sector with critical infrastructure. How's that going?
Yeah, absolutely. So you hit the mark on the head that a lot of times these teams don't really interact with each other. So if we look at some of the tools that we've been putting out, specifically the cross-sector cybersecurity performance goals. So these are the 38 things that we think any organization, no matter what sector you're in, you could be outside of critical infrastructure, and these things are still important. These are 38 practices we think any organization should put in place. And it's funny you point that out because 3 of those controls that are in there are identifying somebody that's important, that's in charge of your cybersecurity, somebody that's in charge of your OT security, and then driving some kind of event that brings them together. So they start building a relationship. But moreover, when I walk into these organizations, the first thing I want to do is understand their critical service. What is that business function that they're doing that if for some reason they couldn't do it, there's no reason to open their doors. And so that critical service is going to cross IT and OT. It's going to be, if they have an OT flavor, there's going to be parts of each of the IT network and the OT network that support that critical service. And so if we can identify what those critical services are, then we start walking it back to developing a baseline, which is actually the first goal within the CPGs or the cybersecurity performance goals, is asset management. What assets are required to keep that critical service going? Doesn't matter if it's IT or it's OT, what do you need to have? And from CISA's perspective, we break assets down into 4 categories. It's people, it's technology, it's information, and it's facilities, no matter where it's at. So if we can start identifying what those assets are, now we can start building controls around it to protect those assets. We can start building the continuity of operations plans. We can start building disaster recovery plans. And so events like CrowdStrike that happened, whether it's a natural disaster or it's a technology glitch or it's an actual threat actor, we've put the foundation in place for us to bring those critical services back up as quickly as possible.
Cybersecurity insurance has been a big topic, right? We have clients that aren't able to get it or their premiums are spiking. And I do know that the insurance companies are starting to ask better questions than they've asked for in the past in regards to recognizing that you do have OT assets in your environment. Tell me the state of those. So do you guys work with the insurance industry at all, per se? I mean, is it from a control perspective, or is it just a free-for-all out there?
I mean, we don't work directly, with the insurance providers themselves. We like to make sure that at least I don't myself, I like to make sure that when I'm interfacing with a stakeholder, whether they're private or public, that they understand that insurance policy is actually part of their incident response plan in most cases, right? And so they have to understand that what are the expectations from that relationship, both directions. If they activate that policy, are they going to get an incident response team that's going to help them with identifying the threat and eliminating the threat and getting operations back up? Or are they just going to fund them to go find their own partnership there? Are there any restrictions on communicating with law enforcement or federal entities like myself? Understand what that looks like. So a lot of times I stress to those stakeholders, hey, when we're doing a tabletop exercise, let's bring that insurance provider in and have that conversation with us so we can understand what does it look like when you go through an event. That's really kind of the role we play with the insurance is making sure the stakeholders understand how that policy works, how they can take advantage of it if they actually absolutely need it.
Right. Some of the directives, that have been coming from the government, both from TSA, you have the CMD DFIN, and you have the ISA IEC 62443. And those have been driving, I guess, the critical infrastructure, but specific verticals that are having to work under those directives from TSA, which CISA is a part of. Can you speak to any of those on the regulation side?
From my perspective, I try to separate myself from the regulatory side of things because our services are at no cost and voluntary. We want to make sure that we have that trusted relationship with a stakeholder when we come in. So my focus will support those regulatory efforts that come out. The idea is that we're trying to secure that critical service, whether it's driven, the reason to do it is from a regulatory perspective or just a pure security perspective. It's kind of where I'm coming at. So I don't really focus a lot with the regulatory side of things. My goal is to secure and keep that critical service up and going.
Fair enough. Early on, when we started, you mentioned AI. So when you think about AI for a second, tell us what you guys are seeing as far as some of the security challenges with AI entering into mainstream.
Absolutely. That's going to kind of go into our Secure by Design initiative, Secure by Demand initiatives that we're pushing out. We can look at AI. It's a new technology that's coming out. We have to understand how it affects our systems, but we also want to make sure that when we do integrate it, it's being integrated in a secure manner. And we understand, what the impacts are to the systems and services we have. So from CISA's perspective, we're releasing a number of resources that helps the manufacturers that are developing these new technologies to start building security into them. So that's through our Secure by Design initiative. The idea is that when we look at those target-rich, resource-sparse organizations, they don't necessarily have the resources or maybe even the understanding on how to secure this stuff off the shelf. So we want to make sure when it comes into the environment, it's already secure. And so that we're pushing it from that direction. And then from the Secure by Demand perspective, this is enabling the customers to better understand what questions to ask of the manufacturers as they're bringing in that technology to make sure that stuff is coming in secure. So from an AI perspective, making sure it's secure by design is important, but then also understanding what's in your environment, what does it interact with? Build those processes and procedures around the use of that technology. I know one of the biggest concerns I have is data put into an AI tool, then you lose ownership of it. What's happening with that data in the background? And that if that's PII or personal identifiable information, that could be an issue. So the organization needs to understand how that tool is being used and build the process, procedures, and requirements around it.
Yeah, I like the term secure by design. My vision is that machine builders, the OEMs and the system integrators who build plants, who do brownfield, greenfield expansions, who provide the machinery that's being used, it's almost like they need to get better. The ecosystem on that side of the fence. I mean, IT's had a pretty good run rate for a couple of decades and developing policies and governance and technologies and building out the resources required to deal with the enterprise. And when I think about secure by design, to me, it's also safety because we call it digital safety when it comes to connected physical systems. And when you're building a car, you put the headlights and the seat belts and the backup cameras and the sensors and the anti-lock brakes on when you build the car. You don't do it after the fact. So as organizations start bringing these tools into their environment, how do they extend those down? So the whole secure by design is a spot on move that we should see in the future, that this equipment becomes more secure and safe as it's being built and delivered. So does it have a role in working with those manufacturers that provide machines to their end clients that are making the required goods for the nation?
Yeah, actually, organizations that want to buy into the Secure by Design and show that they're supporting it, they come out. We have a pledge. We have the Secure by Design pledge. They can actually come out and say, hey, we recognize that these things need to be more secure, more safe as they come out of the manufacturing. And so those organizations, by signing the pledge, are stepping up and saying, hey, we're going to start to eliminate these things and build in security so it's better for the customer and obviously the user when it comes out. So yes, we actually were working with organizations. They have the ability to join us and help with that. And then, of course, the resources that we're putting out that help drive the things they should be focusing on, they can take advantage of those resources also. If anybody wants to dig more down into that, we have a whole page off of CISA.gov, Secure by Design, that goes into that and even talks about, from an organizational perspective, when you're out there trying to source new technology, we want to enable you to know what questions to ask. So there's resources out there for that.
What kind of a relationship does CISA have with the Idaho Labs? Do you guys work with them much? The group that can you touch on that a little bit on the relationship that you guys have with that organization?
Yeah, absolutely. We have a huge relationship with INL. They're actually coming out. They develop training for us. They develop tools for us. They help us with some of the other mission sets that we have. A great example is they'll come out and do industrial control system training sessions for us. We're actually working on planning one here for St. Louis area here in the near future, where they're going to come in and give us 4 days worth of training on how to secure and defend industrial control systems. So as we see the need for new resources, we can partner with INL and ask them to help us build these tools that we need. It's been a great partnership. We've been working with those guys for years.
Yeah. So on the automation technology vendors, as I call them, so Rockwell, Siemens, Emerson, GE, Honeywell, do you guys work with them also? Because they're the ones that are a lot of the manufacturers who make these control systems. So what kind of role does CISA have with those types of manufacturers?
So that would kind of go back to our relationship through the Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative. And so one of the sub portions of the JCDC is going to be focused on OT and automation and things like that. So if they're a member of the JCDC, they're invited to different events that are put on focused on that type of technology. If we're trying to put together new resources that we're going to release, whether it's an advisor or something like that, they would be somebody that we would invite to that conversation to help provide subject matter experts. So yeah, definitely through the Joint Defense, the JCDC, we are absolutely partnering with those types of organizations.
So as we get closer here towards the end, what kind of advice would you give organizations, to ensure their cyber resiliency today? I mean, I know we've talked about a lot of different pieces, but if you could just kind of summarize it all up, what would be your advice?
Absolutely. First off, where I would start in looking at the impacts we just had here recently from a major instance that's happened is know themselves. Understand what the critical services are, what assets support those, and then start building the controls and protections around that. On top of that, practice your incident response plans, your business continuity plans, your disaster recovery plans. Make sure they work. All too often, we'll see organizations, yep, we've got a plan for that. And then when they go and execute it, it doesn't work like they expected. Take that even one step further and start building partnerships. Folks like myself out in the field, or your FBI teams that are out in the field, the Secret Service, or even the fusion centers. We all are here to help collect and share information. In most cases, we'll even come when you're doing your incident response plan or your tabletop exercise, we'll come sit in there and help advise on that and provide some input as to what to expect during an incident. We get to see these incidents on a routine basis. So building those partnerships now allows us to, one, get you ready for it. And then when the time happens, unfortunately it does, it's easy for you to reach out and ask us to come help.
Yeah. A lot of those agencies I recognize, but you mentioned what I haven't heard before, the Fusion Center. Is that what you call it?
Yep.
What?
So there's approximately 80 fusion centers across the United States. You'll find them in large populated areas or just supporting the state as whole. So Missouri has three, as an example, has 3 fusion centers. We got one in St. Louis. We got one in Kansas City. And then we have one that supports the rest of the state of Missouri out in Jefferson City. And their role was established after 9/11 to help break down the communications between the different sectors, right? So when you walk in one of these fusion centers, you're going to see folks from healthcare, the firefighters, local law enforcement. We've got partners from DHS intelligence in there. Myself is routinely in there, along with some of my other counterparts. Here in St. Louis, we have a representation from the Coast Guard. But it's a place for us all to get together and we can share events we're seeing happen and have those conversations about how that affects the other areas. And so members can reach out to the fusion centers. They can become liaisons. They can receive information about threats to their local area. There's other resources they have to provide. So if you haven't plugged in with one of your fusion centers, by all means, I would highly recommend doing that.
That's good to know. I had no idea. Us as a private entity would be able to go and talk to those folks, especially because we do a lot of work in the field with cybersecurity technologies and we find stuff. And that's a collaboration, I would say, would meld with the private sector, if you will, with what the Fusion Center has to offer.
They're always a part of the conversation. When I'm dealing with an incident, they're part of the larger team here in my area. We work very closely with the Fusion Center, the FBI, the Secret Service. We're all trying to be a single task force, we may call it, to help that critical infrastructure right here in our area.
Wow. I want to follow up on that on
Absolutely.
a separate conversation. So with that, I'm going to say thank you, Chris, for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Dino.
Cockburn from CISA, everyone.
Thanks for tuning in to the Industrial Cybersecurity Insider. To stay up to date with our latest episodes, be sure to click the follow or subscribe button now. And if you found this podcast helpful or have a topic you'd like us to discuss, please leave us a review or let us know. Thanks again for listening. See you next time.